Welcome to this presentation, Interpreting the WADA Prohibited List. This presentation is intended to be a primer for healthcare professionals. It is just a brief introduction to some common prescriptions that are prohibited or otherwise restricted for athletes, who are primarily those athletes who are in registered testing pools, might be tested to the WADA code. My name is Ashley Anderson. I am a sports pharmacist who is also certified by the International Olympic Committee with a Drugs in Sport certificate. Our objectives are to be able to locate the resources in anti-doping that are developed for medical professionals. So primarily the USADA Health Pro Advantage and WADA Adel for medical professionals. And then we'll look at the classifications of the WADA Prohibited List, looking at the main three sections and the different classification titles with various drug classes. And then we'll go a little bit into identifying some common drug classes that require either modifications or additional documentation for competitive athletes to use those when they have the appropriate medical indication. First, there are two free online education and anti-doping courses that are available on demand. The first is Health Pro Advantage, offered by USADA. It can be located through the USADA website provided there. Keep in mind that this information is updated on a regular basis, and so I recommend that healthcare professionals check back at least annually to see if there are any changes. The second program is the WADA Adel for medical professionals that you can find at the link provided, and you'll scroll down on that page to find the medical professionals education section. And you can see it's offered in various languages. Again, these programs can be updated as new information comes out. And in the WADA Adel program, sometimes they have additional short sessions for healthcare professionals to update them on more recent changes in the WADA code. There are three sections on the WADA Prohibited List that we want to be aware of. The first is substances or methods that are prohibited at all times, and then substances that are prohibited in competition only, and substances that are prohibited in particular sports. So I've tried to summarize the current WADA Prohibited List there. As you can see, there are prohibited methods that are currently only found as prohibited at all times. For substances that are prohibited in competition only, we want to be aware of washout periods, and that means washed out from the urine sample. So it may be below a certain urinary threshold or be required to wash out completely. So we're not just considering the serum half-life of a drug, but how long does it take to clear from an athlete's urine sample. For substances that are prohibited at all times, we want to help an athlete apply for a therapeutic use exemption or a TUE, typically before using that medication, and we'll go into that a little bit. And then with substances that are prohibited in competition only, there is some clinical situations where an athlete might need to apply for a therapeutic use exemption, especially when the substance that is prohibited in competition only is used for a chronic condition, so the prescription should not be abruptly stopped, or for other reasons it cannot be stopped. For those athletes, we would assist them in applying for a therapeutic use exemption. And then with substances prohibited in particular sport, those can be either prohibited at all times or prohibited in competition only. And currently, the P1 class only includes beta blockers. Each year, the WADA Prohibited List is published around October and goes into effect January 1st of each year. As healthcare professionals, we want to make sure we are always referencing the most up-to-date list. And so here you can see it always opens with a section that is an introduction and gives some explanation about the different definitions that are used and the different classifications. So for instance, we have the current definition for prohibited in competition, prohibited at all times, substances that are specified and non-specified, and substances of abuse. Here is another look at the WADA Prohibited List when we're focusing on the list of classifications. So those prohibited at all times, we have the certain substances, generally by drug classes, but you'll see that several of these classifications actually would incorporate many drug classes or many prescriptions as examples. And then in the methods, there are 3 different methods, and we'll focus for this presentation just on M2 that include IV restrictions. And you can see there are 4 different classifications in the substances that are prohibited in competition only. And as already mentioned, currently for the WADA 2025 prohibited list, beta blockers are the only class of drugs that are prohibited for certain sports. In our role as healthcare professionals who are working with athletes that might be tested, one of the first things we want to do is actually identify who those athletes are. Who are our patients that might be competitive athletes or might be tested for doping? And then when we're working with those patient athletes, look up the status of the drug in sport each time and verify that the method, the route of administration, or the specific therapy is not otherwise restricted or prohibited in sport. As healthcare professionals, we want to take the steps to ensure that the medical documentation is complete, so it clearly demonstrates that there's a medical need, and if a therapeutic use exemption application is necessary, that is clear to the TUE committee why this prohibited substance is necessary. And then we can assist the athletes in providing a copy of the medical records when the athlete is going through the TUE application process. And in this presentation, I'm going to highlight just a couple of common substances or prescription medications that we might be discussing with athletes and how we will help the athlete work through the process of understanding the status of that medication in sport. Instead of searching through the WADA prohibited list that you see here on the screen and trying to find whether or not the prescription that you're looking at prescribing or dispensing is potentially prohibited, or trying to determine if it falls into that catch-all category of like biological effects or chemical structures, you can instead use the search engine GlobalDRO. That's globaldro.com. It stands for Drug Reference Online, and this will give you the status of the drug in sport according to the WADA prohibited list. GlobalDRO can be used as a search engine, and if English is not your preferred language, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, you can change it to one of the other languages. You'll select the athlete's nationality, so here we'll select the United States, and it brings us to the search page where you will select your user type. My preference is to have the athlete be the driver of the search, so I'll have them select athlete, but if you're doing this in place of the athlete, please select your profession. So I am a pharmacist, and be specific with the sport that you are selecting. Remember that there are some variations for the restrictions on certain sports, so we want to be specific. In this example, we will use badminton. And then the nation of purchase of the prescription medication will be the United States, or the purchase of the OTC as well. And then you'll begin to type the first couple letters of the drug into the search box. Let's start with one ingredient example that's very common among athletes: creatine. You can see here when it pulls up the search results, you'll have the terms and conditions that we first want to read through. Make sure the athlete understands these terms and conditions, but I want to highlight that the dietary supplements are not going to be listed on GlobalDRO unless they are specifically prohibited by WADA. So in our example, creatine does not have a result. It is not specifically prohibited. Because it is a supplement, when we're working with athletes or as a reminder for ourselves as healthcare professionals, we do want to click this middle result here. Oops, it is a supplement. And that will take us to USADA's Supplement Connect, where we can find more information on substances that are on the high-risk list. And if an athlete is looking to use any supplements, we do want to check to see whether or not it is listed specifically on USADA's high-risk list. Currently, with a lack of regulation on the dietary supplement market, dietary supplements do pose risk to our athletes and the general public. But today we'll focus on risk reduction for the athletes. So our first step in trying to reduce that risk is actually assessing whether or not a dietary supplement is actually needed. Athletes are encouraged to use a food-first approach. So when they're looking at using a dietary supplement, our first question as a medical professional would be, what's the indication for use? And then if there is an indication, is it necessary to use a dietary supplement, or can we find a prescription product that has better quality control so that we have more reassurance on what the athlete is actually ingesting? Then we can also ask, should this athlete consult with a sports dietitian? Do they have some gaps in their diet that they're trying to fill? Or is this athlete on some type of restricted diet? And does this restricted diet potentially raise other health concerns that we might need to explore? The second step would be assessing the third-party testing. Who are the companies that are actually testing these products to determine whether or not they are safe and match the label, and they're not otherwise adulterated or misbranded? One logo that you might already be familiar with is the USP logo. That does offer us some level of reassurance on dietary supplements, but when we see this logo on the label, it just tells us that the contents match what is labeled. It does not screen for performance-enhancing substances or things that would be doping agents for which an athlete might test positive. So the next level of third-party testing would be NSF Certified for Sport. This logo is endorsed by USADA and many other sports organizations, but as healthcare professionals, we need to keep in mind that NSF Certified for Sport does not test every batch. And this may lead to problems or confusion for the athletes or even people who are recommending or selling NSF certified products, because a logo could be on the bottle, but we need to look up the batch number every time to see if that specific lot has been tested to ensure that it does not have any doping substances in that specific lot. So there are companies that do test every batch. Two examples would be BSCG and Informed Sport. For those who are interested in understanding a comparison between the different third-party testing companies and what they are looking for when they test products, BSCG has put together a comparison chart. Now, obviously, this is on their website, and so BSCG is highlighted to compare it to the other organizations. But you can see here the menu of tests, what is tested for specifically, and it even gives some information about whether or not every lot is tested, which is very important for our athletes. And if not every lot is tested, we need to actually go to the website and look for the specific batch number. So this gives us a little bit more assurance with the companies that do test every batch or every lot number. Here is an example of a search result that shows a prescription that is not prohibited. So let's use the example of fluoxetine. You can see here it populates the ingredient itself or specific strengths of the different products that are available on the market. Or if you do the general search, it's going to give you those results on this page here. And you can see you can select the base ingredient or look for the specific brand. Now, brand just means country specific. It doesn't necessarily mean brand name, as you can see in this example. And let's say our athlete is beginning a fluoxetine hydrochloride 10 milligram tablet. In the results, you'll see that it provides a green box showing us it is not prohibited in competition or out of competition. That means it's okay to take at any time for the athlete. And you'll see in each result that this is going to pop up with the reminder that if it is taken by the IV route, that it cannot exceed a certain volume limit. But of course, it's not relevant for this search result, but this is going to pop up with every one of your search results. Now we're going to search for an ingredient that is prohibited at all times. So let's look up the prescription insulin. and we can see the results here. As you can see that all types of insulin have been categorized under the single insulin because we will treat insulin products the same. When you select on that result, you'll see it's prohibited in competition and prohibited out of competition. It gives us the WADA classification. When you scroll down on the page at the bottom, you'll find the link to the therapeutic use exemption to help the athlete begin the application process, which will take us to the link for the USADA therapeutic use exemption step-by-step process. And you can see here on the left-hand side, we've already determined for insulin that it is needed, a TUE is needed, and the athlete will walk through the application process. When assisting an athlete in the application process, if you click Apply for a TUE, you'll see that the athlete does need to find their condition. So in this case, we're looking at diabetes and the use of insulin. There is a USADA checklist and WADA guidance documents in order to help us put together the medical documentation that's necessary before it's submitted for the application. Another good example of a substance that is prohibited at all times would be the diuretic spironolactone. So we might see this used in our otherwise young and healthy female athletes, and we want to be aware that this substance is prohibited at all times, and so a therapeutic use exemption would need to be applied for and approved prior to the athlete competing in any events where they might be tested. And obviously our registered testing pool athletes would need to have approval prior to starting this medication because it's typically not urgently started, not emergent use that we need to use this product for. If you scroll down to the bottom of the page, again, it's going to take you to the therapeutic use exemption link where we can help the athlete begin their application process. That TUE link at the bottom of the page is going to take you back to USADA's website, and we can scroll down here because not all of our athletes are going to be registered testing pool athletes or competitive athletes at this time, but we want to make sure if they are thinking of competing, what class of athlete do they fit into? What's their level of competition? And one of the easiest ways to do that is actually have the athlete fill out this TUE pre-check form and allow USADA to work with the athlete to determine their level of competition and whether or not they need to take the next step to apply for a therapeutic use exemption. We're now going to search for a prescription that would be prohibited in competition only, and we're going to use the example from the classification of glucocorticoids because those are prohibited in competition only, but by specific routes. So let's use the example of triamcinolone. And you can see here again, we can select by the ingredient, or you'll find some specific brands or products with specific routes of administration. So let's pick a topical cream. And when we select that cream, you'll see the results are not prohibited, either in and out of competition. This is a route-specific result. If you were to pick triamcinolone for the ingredient itself, let's look at those results. So selecting the ingredient, you can see that the glucocorticoids are going to be prohibited in competition only by specific routes. So currently, as of 2025, the routes that are restricted in competition only are any type of injectable, oral route, or rectal route. So basically systemic use. And you'll see below that there are some examples of other routes that are not prohibited in competition, and those are typically local use or for local effect. But always look up the specific route of administration when you're considering glucocorticoids. And if using a route that is prohibited in competition only, we again need to abide by the washout periods. The glucocorticoids washout table that's published by WADA is one of those few washout tables that we have to reference for athletes that gives us specific guidance on how long an athlete should stop taking a medication for an in-competition drug. So on the results page of Global DRO, if you scroll down on your glucocorticoid result, you'll find that there's an external link to the WADA website, and should link us to the current document for the glucocorticoid therapeutic use exemption guidelines, When you download those guidelines, again, make sure you're looking for the most current guidelines, and you'll find the specific washout table that gives you guidance on how long an athlete should stop taking the medication before competing. As of 2025, this is the current document from WADA's website. So when I download the glucocorticoids and the therapeutic use exemptions document, you can read through the introduction there, obviously, and then scroll down to the glucocorticoid washout table that WADA has published. We want to be aware that we're looking at both the route of administration, and then sometimes specific drugs will have longer washout periods. And on the right-hand side there, that's the minimum amount of time that the athlete would need to stop taking that medication before the competition period, the in-competition period. For our final example, let's look at a product that is actually a substance that does not have government approval, but is very trendy and popular among anti-aging and some compounding pharmacies that might label themselves as sports pharmacy centers. But we need to be aware that some of the substances that are floating around in these compounding pharmacies are actually prohibited and cause a risk to the athletes to potentially test positive from cross-contamination, or because the athlete's not fully informed about the status of that substance. Let's use the example of BPC 157. So you can see that it comes up in the search results, and when we click on that, it will clearly display that it is prohibited both in and out of competition. And so even when the substance is not something that it is a prescription, say for in this instance it's a biologic, then we want to be sure that everything that the athlete is being exposed to that we're prescribing or recommending, that we understand what the status of sport is and that the athlete is fully informed before they're actually being exposed to that substance. As healthcare professionals who are working with athletes, we become athlete support personnel. Athlete support personnel have defined responsibilities that include anti-doping awareness. Healthcare professionals help athletes avoid inadvertent doping by interpreting the status of drugs in sport before prescribing or before dispensing. We know the anti-doping code and understand that we can be held accountable for any anti-doping rule violations as well as the athlete. Let's conclude by looking at the key points in this presentation. First, complete the educational sessions that are available free online to educate yourself in anti-doping. Next, always check the status of the prescription or the over-the-counter drug or the dietary ingredient on globaldro.com in real time, so you can make sure to give the athlete the most accurate, up-to-date information for the status of that substance. And keep in mind that not all dietary ingredients are going to be listed on GlobalDro. Those will only be the dietary ingredients that are specifically prohibited in sport by WADA. Next, observe the washout periods for any drugs that are prohibited in competition only. So check the event information to understand what that in competition period is. Otherwise, we'll use the WADA definition for that defined in competition time period. And then when an athlete does need to apply for a therapeutic use exemption or a TUE, we'll help them through that process and remind them that we should await for approval before they start the new medication whenever that's clinically appropriate for a substance that is prohibited at all times, if it's an athlete who is in a registered testing pool. And next, we always want to keep in mind that every dietary supplement is a doping risk for an athlete who might be tested. Because of that risk of contamination of dietary supplements, we want to make sure that we help the athlete confirm that the actual batch, the actual lot number that they're looking at purchasing has been tested by a trusted, independent third-party company that screens not just to make sure that the label is accurate for what's in there, but it also screens for any prohibited substances that might not be listed on the label, that might be contaminated in our product. Thank you so much for taking these initial steps and becoming a more informed healthcare professional as you work with athletes. Before you go, I want to share one more piece of information. Sports pharmacist. Currently in 2025, there are no requirements for training standards for a person to call themselves a sports pharmacist. Now, we hope at a minimum they would at least be a registered pharmacist. But beyond that, in order to use the title of pharmacist, there are no minimum requirements. And some have used this title simply for self-branding or marketing purposes. And in that, we have found that they are giving inaccurate information and sometimes even misleading athletes into what they should use. And we want to be well aware that sports pharmacists should be held to the same anti-doping standards as the athletes that they are giving recommendations to or treating. And with that, the U.S. Sports Pharmacy Group is putting together a training program where we will create some minimum standards for the education of pharmacists in order to work with athletes who are in a registered testing pool. And that program is called the Team Pharmacist Training. If you haven't seen it launched yet, please look at the U.S. Sports Pharmacy Group website for more information. Thank you so much for your time and attention.